Hey dreamers, tonight we're stepping through the veils of time, back to an age when Olympus was still young, and the roles of gods and goddesses were only beginning to take shape. This is the story of Artemis, the virgin huntress, the moon maiden, the wild-hearted protector who would choose independence over every destiny offered to her. Long before the silver bow, before the forests she claimed as her own, her path was already set apart from the rest of the divine. But here's what makes her origin so fascinating. Why does Artemis insist on living untouched and unclaimed? What sparks her devotion to the wilderness? And how does a goddess earn the unwavering loyalty of both hunters and moonlight itself? Before we settle in, tap like and subscribe if these stories bring you calm, and tell me in the comments who's your favourite mythic figure. Picture this. Imagine being pursued across an entire continent because your lover didn't have the decency to keep his affairs quiet. This is where Leto begins her story. She was a titaness, one of those older, primal divine beings who came before the Olympians truly took their throne. Graceful, powerful, and tragically bound to fall in love with Zeus, the king of gods himself. But here's where divine politics get messy. Zeus already had a wife, Hera, a goddess whose jealousy was as legendary as it was justified. Hera didn't just sulk when she discovered Zeus's infidelity. No, she orchestrated revenge campaigns with the kind of meticulous planning that would make a mortal strategist weep with envy. It was, in many ways, a solution that was as elegant as it was unnecessarily complicated. A signature of divine project management, perhaps, but with considerably higher stakes. When Hera learned that Leto was carrying Zeus's children, she didn't simply curse them. Instead, she enacted a curse of startling specificity. Leto could not give birth anywhere on solid land. Not on the mainland. Not on any island that was properly anchored to the ocean floor, rooted in the earth by the ancient chains of geography. Hera had thought through every loophole, or so she believed. So Leto began to wander. Imagine this. A goddess in the advanced stages of pregnancy, growing heavier with each passing day, travelling through forests that grew thicker and darker with the weight of Hera's malice. The mountains rose up before her, offering their peaks, but she could not climb them, for they were solid earth. The valleys beckoned with soft grass, but she could not rest there, for they were part of the mainland. Even the islands that dotted the Mediterranean turned her away, frightened by the thought of Hera's retribution should they offer her shelter. It's written in the ancient sources that Leto didn't travel alone. The goddesses Dione, Rhea, Themis, and Amphitrite accompanied her divine witnesses to her suffering, but even with their presence, even surrounded by other powerful beings, Leto moved through a world that had become her prison. Other lands refused her. Cities slammed their gates. Villages turned their people inward when they heard she approached, as if her very footsteps might bring divine punishment upon their doorsteps. And all the while, she carried the weight of two divine infants within her, their celestial presence growing stronger with each moment that passed. The pain of pregnancy intensified as the curse deepened. The sensations became overwhelming. The stretching of her immortal form, the pressure of divine beings preparing to enter the world, the burning shame of being hunted like a criminal when her only crime was loving the wrong god. Childbirth for mortals is the most intense experience the human body can endure. For a goddess, multiply that by all the impossible emotions and all the cosmic weight of carrying future deities. This was Leto's suffering, and it stretched on without respite. There's something particularly cruel about a curse that targets one of the most vulnerable moments of existence. Hera, in her rage, had found the one way to make Leto's journey not just difficult, but desperate. The goddess had 9 months to contemplate the precision of her punishment with every step she took. But then, in a moment that would echo through history for thousands of years, there came an island that was not quite an island. Not in the way Hera's curse demanded anyway. Delos was born from a transformation. Originally, it had been a floating island, a place without roots, without moorings to the earth below. It drifted in the wine-dark sea like a secret, invisible and unnamed, called Delos, the unseen. The gods themselves had transformed it from a nymph. Or perhaps it had always been a gift waiting for the right moment. Poseidon, Zeus's brother and the god of the sea, had claimed ownership of this strange, floating piece of land. When word reached Poseidon of his brother's desperation, of Leto's unbearable suffering, he made a decision. He raised 4 great granite columns up from the depths of the ocean floor, anchoring Delos in place. But here was the crucial detail. Everyone understood what had happened. Everyone knew that Delos had been freed from its wandering, that it had become a proper island through divine intervention. But the technical interpretation of Hera's curse had been circumvented through the kind of clever loophole that only gods could devise. Yes, Delos was now anchored, but it had been a floating island first. It had not always been land, and in the complex logic of divine law, there existed a space where Leto could give birth. Moreover, Delos itself, that island consciousness that existed in the ancient imagination as something almost alive, almost a character in its own right, made a pact with Leto. This is extraordinary. The island offered itself as a sanctuary, understanding the risk it took. If Hera were to turn her attention to the island, divine retribution could be catastrophic. Islands cannot flee. They cannot hide. But Delos offered shelter anyway. Leto swore an oath by the waters of the river Styx, the most binding oath a being can make, that her son Apollo would build a magnificent temple upon this island, honouring it forever, making it sacred beyond measure. With that promise, Delos became not just an island, but the beginning of an ancient pilgrimage site that would endure for thousands of years. Imagine this moment. The water grows calm. The light shimmers across the Aegean. Waves that had been choppy and unwelcoming suddenly develop a rhythm that feels almost like invitation. Delos rises from the sea, no longer invisible, no longer wandering. Leto, having travelled across continents, across pain and fear and cosmic indignity, finally finds a place where she can rest. The island itself seems to hold its breath. When Leto finally arrived on Delos, the relief must have been immense, and yet the pain was far from over. She made her way to an olive tree on the island, grasping its smooth, ancient trunk with both hands. The tree seemed to grow from the very heart of the island, as if it had been waiting for her, as if this moment had been written into its rings since the day it sprouted from the soil. Around her, the island itself seemed to come alive. The grass beneath her feet felt soft, supple, the ground welcoming. She could feel the presence of the sea all around her, not as a barrier now, but as a protective circle. The air held the salt tang of ocean spray, mixed with something sweeter, something that spoke of herbs growing wild on the island's slopes. But Hera wasn't finished. Oh no, the Queen of Gods had saved her cruelest trick for the culmination of Leto's journey. Hera had kidnapped Eileithyia. Eileithyia was the goddess of childbirth and midwifery, the divine being whose presence could ease a woman's labour, whose knowledge and power could guide a child safely into the world. She was the answer to a labouring mother's prayers, the one who understood the sacred geometry of birth itself, and Hera had taken her away, holding her captive on Mount Olympus. Without Eileithyia's presence, Leto's labour could not progress. So began a tragedy written in time and pain. Leto entered into the most intense labour that even a goddess could endure. 9 nights and 9 days of contractions without relief, of her body trying to birth divine twins, while Hera's cruelty kept the one being who could help her locked away. Can you imagine that kind of suffering? The waves of pain coming and receding, building and intensifying, with no promise of an end. The night sky wheeling overhead, the stars seeming to pulse with her contractions. The island itself holding vigil, watching this sacred agony unfold. The grass where she gripped and twisted began to show the patterns of her movements. The very earth seemed to feel her pain, resonating with frequencies that only the most ancient of the world could perceive. The other goddesses, Dione, Rhea, Themis, and Aphrodite, stayed close by her side. They could not take her pain, but they could bear witness to it. Their presence itself was a kind of comfort, though it could not ease the physical torment. They moved through the hours with her, spoke to her during the moments when Leto had the strength to listen. And then, at some point deep in the ninth night, when the pain had become so profound that it seemed to transcend physical sensation and become something closer to transformation, something miraculous happened. Leto gave birth to Artemis, and this is where the story becomes extraordinary. The ancient sources are unanimous on this point. Artemis entered the world without causing her mother pain. While Leto was suffering unimaginable agony carrying her, while the labor stretched on for 9 endless days, the moment Artemis was born, it was a moment of clarity. It was, quite literally, a gift. The child simply emerged into the world whole and perfect, without tearing or trauma or the violent transition that even goddess bodies experience. Some sources suggest it happened with such ease, such perfection, that it seemed almost dreamlike. One moment, Leto was in the depths of contractions, and the next, her daughter was there, in her arms, looking up at her with ancient eyes. This is significant. This is the very reason why Artemis would become known as a goddess of childbirth itself, why women would call upon her name when their own time came. It's not because she had given birth herself. In fact, she would famously refuse ever to do so. Rather, it was because she understood childbirth from the moment of her own entry into the world. She had experienced that threshold moment. She had crossed from non-existence into being, and she had done so with a grace that transcended pain. The newborn goddess was alert. Divine children don't arrive helpless and wailing like mortal infants. They arrive conscious, aware, already shimmering with the power that will define them across the ages. When Artemis opened her eyes on the island of Delos for the first time, she could see the stars, could feel the weight of her own divinity settling into her form. And immediately, almost without hesitation, she understood what needed to happen next. Her mother was still in labor. Leto's body contracted again. Her face twisted with renewed pain, for she still carried Apollo within her. The labor that had been so easy with Artemis immediately reversed course into agony. The 9th night seemed to extend into a 10th, and then an 11th, and the pain became fresh once more. This is where Artemis made her choice. The newborn goddess, not even minutes old, not even holding her first breath for long, looked at her mother's face twisted in pain, and she understood. In that moment of pure understanding, before she had even learned language or the complex rules of divinity, Artemis became a midwife. She reached for her mother. She helped guide her brother Apollo into the world. The ancient texts call this an act of devotion. Modern readers might recognize it as something even more profound, a newborn recognizing suffering and acting to alleviate it. Before Artemis had a single memory, before she had a name that meant anything more than the vibration of divine air, she had already become essential to another being's survival. Apollo came forth into the world as his twin sister helped ease his passage. Some versions of the tale suggest that when Apollo was born, the island itself seemed to glow. Light blazed across Delos as the god of sun and light entered the world. Flowers bloomed impossibly on the island, as if celebrating his arrival. The entire universe seemed to pause and acknowledge that a great power had just arrived. But in that moment, Artemis would have been paying attention to none of that. She would have been focused entirely on her mother, on ensuring that Leto's suffering had finally ended, that both her children had crossed safely into existence. There's a profound irony in this, which the ancient storytellers seem to delight in pointing out. Artemis, who would spend her entire eternal existence rejecting motherhood and childbirth, who would demand of Zeus that she be allowed to remain a virgin forever and never bear children, had served as a midwife at the moment of her own birth. She had helped bring her brother into existence. She had been present at the most intimate, most vulnerable moment of her mother's life. And in that moment she was shaped forever. She understood the intensity of motherhood, the power of it, the terrible cost of it. And she understood that this life, the life of bearing children, of being defined by one's ability to reproduce, was not for her. Now here's something that requires us to adjust our thinking about divinity. Mortal children grow at a measurable pace. Months become years, and years are needed before a child can walk or speak or think in complex ways. Divine children don't follow the same timeline. There are suggestions in the ancient texts that Artemis was brought to Mount Olympus shortly after her birth. She entered into a unique kind of childhood, if you could call it that, where she lived among the gods and was surrounded by their power and their immortal presence. 3 years passed. In those 3 years, Artemis developed in ways that would have been impossible for a mortal child. She grew in consciousness and capability, in understanding and divine presence. She was there on Olympus with her brother Apollo, who was learning his own gifts, mastering music, developing his role as the god of prophecy, beginning to understand the weight of his own immortal responsibilities. She was surrounded by the other Olympians, her father Zeus, still radiating his authority, her grandmother Hera, who had learned to accept, if not approve of, these divine bastards. Around her were the other gods and goddesses, each one powerful in their own right, each one serving as examples of how divine beings conducted themselves. But Artemis was already different. From the first moment of consciousness, she seems to have been thinking of what she wanted, rather than accepting what was assigned to her. The ancient poet Callimachus captured this beautifully in his hymn to Artemis, where he describes the young goddess approaching her father. She was 3 years old, not in years of powerlessness and dependency as a mortal child would be, but 3 years of divine development and active consciousness. She climbed into Zeus's lap. This is important. There's an intimacy here that speaks to her confidence and her father's affection for her. Even Zeus, king of gods and wielder of thunderbolt power, allowed this young goddess to curl up against him, trusting in this moment. And then she asked for everything she would ever want. "Father," Artemis said, and her voice carried the clarity of one who already knew exactly what she desired. "I wish to remain your maiden always, never a woman, never subject to the bonds of marriage or the vulnerability that comes with being claimed by another. I want to be free in a way that most beings, mortal or divine, will never understand." And then the requests began to pour forth, each one carefully considered, each one speaking to the specific nature of the goddess she intended to become. "I want many names," she continued, "in case I grow weary of one. I want a bow and arrow, but silver, not gold. I want my own hunting hounds, fierce and swift ones. I want 50 ocean nymphs to sing for me, composed of the daughters of Oceanus, all of them 9 years old and ungirdled, young and wild and free like I intend to remain. I want 20 nymphs from the woods, handmaidens from the valley of Amnisus, who will help me tend my hunting equipment, who will keep my buskins polished and my bowstring strong. I want the mountains as my sacred places, my domains where no mortal could command me or demand anything of me. And I want one city, just one, so that you cannot say I rejected all of civilization entirely." This was a child rewriting the script of what it meant to be a goddess. Here's what makes this remarkable. Artemis wasn't asking for power in the traditional sense. She wasn't asking for dominion over love or war or the harvest. She wasn't asking for temples or daily sacrifices or the ability to punish mortals who displeased her. Well, she would have those things eventually, but they weren't the focus of her request. What Artemis was asking for was autonomy, freedom. the right to define herself entirely on her own terms. And Zeus. Let's pause here, because Zeus is often depicted as tyrannical and controlling, and he certainly was in many myths. In this case, Zeus listened. He listened to his daughter's specific, articulate vision of her own future, and he granted it. In fact, he seems to have been impressed. According to Callimachus, Zeus went further than she asked. "For a child like you," Zeus reportedly said, "it is worthwhile. You shall have all you ask for and more." He granted her the gift of eternal chastity, that she would never be compelled to marry, never be forced into the role that Hera had designed for most goddesses. But then, and this is the most intriguing part, he also granted her something else. He gave her the gift of being able to change her mind. She had eternal chastity, but she also retained the free will to choose differently at some point, should she ever decide to. Of course, she never would. Artemis never wavered in her choice, not once across all the centuries and centuries of stories. But the gift itself, the choice to grant her the power of choice, speaks to something important about how the gods in their wisdom understood her. They were giving her the gift of ultimate freedom, the freedom to choose what she had already chosen, freely, every single day. And then Zeus did something even more extraordinary. He told her that beyond all the gifts he was bestowing, the nymphs, the mountains, the city, the eternal virginity, she had the right to claim her own gifts. She would go out into the world herself. She would choose her own bow, her own hunting dogs, her own magical companions. They would belong to her not because some powerful being had handed them down, but because she had selected them herself. And so, Callimachus tells us, the greatest gift of all was that you shall go out and choose your own gifts, so that they will have a special value. Artemis left the throne room of Mount Olympus with permission granted and freedom essentially handed to her as a birthright. But she also left with a specific understanding. What she wanted next, she would have to pursue herself. Her first destination was the forge of Hephaestus, the divine craftsman, the god of metalwork and all things created by heat and hammer and impossible precision. His workshop existed deep within a mountain, a place where divine fire burned hotter than any earthly flame, where the very stones themselves seemed to pulse with creative potential. Hephaestus was crafting something when Artemis arrived. He was always crafting something. His hands were stained with the residue of countless projects, his face flushed from the heat of the forge. When he looked up and saw who had come seeking him out, he understood immediately that she was not simply requesting a weapon. Artemis told him exactly what she wanted, a bow made of silver, not gold, silver specifically. This is important because it speaks to the very heart of what she understood about herself. Gold was the metal of sunlight and warmth and the daytime sky. Silver was the metal of moonlight, of the hidden hours, of mystery and the wild places where civilization hadn't yet reached. Gold was for Apollo. Silver was for Artemis. Hephaestus considered this request. Silver is notoriously difficult to work with. It requires a specific kind of heat, a particular type of skill. Working with gold is more forgiving. It becomes malleable, yields to the hammer more easily. Silver demands a cooler touch, a different kind of knowledge. Silver is much more difficult to work with than gold, Hephaestus told her, according to the ancient sources. It requires cool light. It should be made underwater, where the temperature can be precisely controlled, where the element itself can infuse every fiber of the weapon. He directed her to the depths of the sea to find the Cyclopes, those one-eyed beings who lived in the underwater forges beneath the waves, who possessed a mastery of their element that even surpassed Hephaestus himself. So Artemis, along with her newly chosen ocean nymphs, dove beneath the surface of the sea. Can you imagine this moment? The pressure of the water surrounding you, the light filtering down from above in patterns that seemed almost alive, the sense of descending into a realm that few mortals and fewer still divine beings ever entered. The Cyclopes worked in their underwater forges, and they accepted the commission from this young goddess. They fashioned her a bow of silver that was extraordinary, perfectly balanced, beautiful in its simplicity, capable of shooting arrows with perfect accuracy. They crafted arrows to match, shafts of silver that would never dull, never lose their edge. When the bow was completed, Artemis emerged from the sea, holding it high above her head, screaming with joy according to the accounts. She ran across fields and valleys and hills, her newly chosen nymphs following her with floating hair and laughing, singing, celebrating. This was not the weapon of a conqueror or a warrior claiming dominance. This was the tool of a being who had just claimed her own agency, who had just proven that she could manifest her vision of herself into reality. But she wasn't finished with her quest yet. Her next destination was Arcadia, the wild and mountainous region where Pan, the goat-footed god of wild nature, shepherds, and the untamed places, made his home. Pan was feeding his hounds when Artemis arrived, butchering lynx meat from Mount Minelos to feed the animals. Here again we see the ancient sources delighting in a kind of cosmic irony. Artemis, who would become the protector of wild animals, was receiving her hunting dogs from the god who represented raw, wild nature itself. The Cyclopes had crafted her weapon, but her companions, the living, breathing beings who would run with her, came from Pan. Pan selected his very best animals. According to Callimachus, he gave her 2 black and white dogs, 3 reddish ones, and 1 spotted hound. But then, and this is the extraordinary part, he selected 7 of the swiftest Cynosaurian hounds, the fastest breed known to any of the gods. These weren't ordinary hunting dogs. These were hounds that could outpace the wind itself, that could catch anything that ran, that possessed an intelligence almost as sophisticated as a divine being's own. These 7 bitches, female hounds bred for speed and for the hunt, became legendary. They could track a stag by its footprints alone. They could catch a hare. They could bring down lions with their fierce coordination and absolute loyalty to their mistress. Artemis must have felt something like completion when she held those leashes in her hand. She had her bow. She had her nymphs. She had her hunting dogs. She had her mountains. She had her freedom. She had everything she had asked for, and everything she had chosen for herself. According to the sources, she was wild to try out her new gifts. Before we move forward, we need to linger for a moment on this concept of eternal chastity, because it's one of the most misunderstood aspects of Artemis's story. Modern readers sometimes interpret it through a lens of shame or purity, seeing it as some kind of limitation placed on the goddess. But that's fundamentally misreading what the ancient world meant by this term. When Artemis asked Zeus for eternal maidenhood, she was asking for something radically different from what modern ears might initially perceive. In ancient Greek society, a woman's status was determined largely by her relationships to men, as a daughter, a wife, a mother. Her identity was inseparable from these roles. A maiden, in Greek culture, was specifically an unmarried woman, a girl or young woman who had not yet been claimed by a husband, who had not yet entered into the domestic life that was expected of her. But there was another layer to this. A maiden goddess was a goddess who maintained absolute autonomy. She could not be commanded by a husband. She could not be bound by the expectations of motherhood or domestic life. She existed entirely on her own terms. When Artemis asked for eternal maidenhood, she was asking for the freedom to live as she chose, to hunt when she wanted to hunt, to roam the mountains alone or with her chosen companions, to make decisions about her own body, her own time, her own purpose, without having to answer to anyone else or justify her choices to a patriarchal structure. It was, in many ways, the most radical request that could be made in a world where women's roles were rigidly defined and limited. And Zeus granted it. He gave her not just the status of maidenhood, but the eternal quality of it. meaning that she could never be forced out of it through aging or circumstance or manipulation. She would be eternally young, eternally free, eternally outside the systems that bound other beings, mortal and divine. The first hunt is never forgotten, not by mortals, not by gods, and certainly not by a divine being who had spent 3 years preparing for the moment when she would finally step into the wilderness and claim her true purpose. Artemis stood at the edge of the forest with her silver bow in hand, her newly chosen hounds at her side, and the mountains rising before her like an invitation written in stone and sky. Behind her lay Mount Olympus with all its politics and divine obligations, but ahead lay something that called to the very core of who she was. The wilderness stretched endlessly before her, untamed and wild, filled with creatures that moved according to their own rhythms, rather than the dictates of civilization. This was where she belonged, and she knew it with the kind of certainty that requires no explanation or justification. The ancient sources tell us that she ran, that the moment her quest was complete and she held everything she had asked for, she couldn't contain her joy any longer. She ran across fields and valleys and hills with her nymphs following behind, their laughter echoing across the landscape like music. But eventually the running had to give way to something deeper, something more purposeful. She had her tools, she had her companions, and now she needed to understand what it meant to truly be the goddess of the hunt. There's a reason Artemis chose the mountains rather than the valleys or the cultivated plains where humans built their cities and tended their fields. The mountains represented everything that civilization was not. They were steep and dangerous, filled with hidden paths and sudden cliffs, inhabited by creatures that answered to no master. When you climbed high enough, the air itself changed, becoming thinner and colder and somehow more honest. Up there, pretense fell away, and what remained was only the essential truth of survival and skill and the relationship between predator and prey. Homer called her Potnia Theron, the mistress of animals, a title that reached back through the ages to the Bronze Age and beyond, to representations of a woman standing between a pair of animals in a pose that suggested not dominance, but understanding. This wasn't about conquest or control in the way that kings controlled their subjects or generals commanded their armies. This was about something older and more primal, a recognition that she belonged to the wild places, that she understood the language of creatures who lived and died according to the seasons and the hunt. In Arcadia, that wild and mountainous region that became particularly sacred to her, Artemis hunted with 20 nymphs who accompanied her during the chase, and with 60 others, daughters of Oceanus, who held dances with her in the forests of the mountains. Can you imagine those moments? The light filtering through ancient pines, the sound of footsteps moving in perfect synchronization across terrain that would have broken the ankles of less skilled beings, the sudden stillness when prey was spotted, and the entire group froze as one. These weren't casual outings or recreational activities designed to pass the time between divine responsibilities. These were the moments when Artemis was most completely herself, when the role she had chosen and the gifts she had claimed came together in perfect harmony. 1. The mountains she claimed as her sacred places had names that would become legendary: Taygetus, Erymanthus, and Mainalis in Arcadia. Mount Erymanthos in particular held a special significance, for it was there that she was known as the mistress of the animals, and when the old goddess became wrathful, when her anger was stirred by some violation or disrespect, she would send the terrible Erymanthian boar to lay waste to fields and terrorize the countryside. This was part of her nature too, this capacity for vengeance, this understanding that the wild places she protected could turn hostile when provoked. But mostly, the mountains were places of joy for her, places where she could draw her golden bow and rejoice in the chase, sending out shafts that flew true and brought down game with precision that mortals could only dream of achieving. The ancient hymns describe how the tops of the high mountains trembled when she hunted, how the tangled wood echoed with the outcry of beasts, how even the earth itself seemed to quake with the power of her presence. And when she was satisfied, when she had cheered her heart with the hunt and felt the deep satisfaction of skill perfectly executed, she would slacken her supple bow and make her way to visit her brother Apollo in Delphi, where they would order the lovely dance of the Muses and Graces together. Here's where Artemis becomes complicated, where the ancient logic requires us to adjust our modern thinking about what it means to be both a huntress and a protector of animals. To our contemporary minds, these roles seem contradictory. How can you hunt creatures while simultaneously protecting them? But the Greeks understood something that we've sometimes forgotten in our separation from the natural world. Hunting and protection are not opposites when approached with the right understanding and respect. The deer was her most sacred animal, and this is significant beyond measure. She drove a chariot drawn by 4 stags with golden antlers, and she was often depicted holding or hunting a deer, or wearing a deerskin cape draped over her shoulders. The ancient epithets called her Elaphobolos, the stag killer, and yet deer was simultaneously under her protection. This wasn't hypocrisy or divine inconsistency. Rather, it represented a profound understanding that hunting, when done correctly and respectfully, was part of the natural order. The hunt maintained balance in the wilderness, prevented overpopulation and starvation, and honored the animals by requiring skill and courage from the hunter. But Artemis's protection of animals meant that she demanded respect for that natural order. Hunters who killed for sport rather than need, who showed arrogance rather than reverence, who wasted what they killed or showed cruelty in their methods, these hunters faced her legendary wrath. Her anger wasn't capricious or random, though mortals who suffered it might have felt otherwise. She punished those who crossed boundaries, who failed to understand that the wilderness belonged to her and operated according to her rules. The most celebrated of her sacred animals was the golden-horned Cerinician hind, the creature that Heracles was sent to fetch as one of his 12 labors. This wasn't just any deer. This was an animal that represented the impossible intersection of beauty and strength, of grace and divine power. The fact that even Heracles, the greatest hero of Greek mythology, had to pursue this creature for an entire year before finally capturing it speaks to the special nature of Artemis's sacred animals. They weren't simply beasts to be hunted or trophies to be claimed. They were beings that carried something of her own essence within them, that moved through the world with a quality that transcended ordinary animal existence. The nymphs who accompanied Artemis weren't simply servants or attendants assigned to her by divine decree. They were beings who had chosen to follow her path, who had embraced the same commitment to eternal maidenhood and the freedom of the wilderness that defined the goddess herself. When Artemis had made her request to Zeus as a child, she had asked specifically for 50 ocean nymphs and 20 nymphs from the woods, young and wild and free, ungirdled and unbound by the expectations that governed most female existence in the ancient world. These companions weren't background figures in Artemis's story. They were essential to who she was and how she moved through the world. They hunted with her, dancing through forests and across mountain slopes with a coordination and skill that came from years of practice and shared purpose. They helped her tend her equipment, keeping her buskins polished and her bowstrings strong. They sang for her, their voices rising in harmonies that seemed to merge with the sounds of the wilderness itself, the wind through pine branches, the rush of mountain streams, the distant calls of birds. But more than that, they represented a community of choice rather than obligation. In a world where most relationships were determined by family ties, marriage arrangements, and social hierarchies, the bond between Artemis and her nymphs was something different. It was a fellowship based on shared values and mutual respect, on the understanding that they had all chosen a life outside the conventional paths that society laid out for women. And Artemis protected them fiercely. The ancient sources make it clear that she expected her companions to maintain the same commitment to chastity that she herself embodied, and she reacted with devastating anger when that commitment was violated, particularly when the violation came through force or deception. This wasn't about prudishness or some abstract moral standard. It was about the fundamental principle of autonomy, about the right of these beings to live according to the choices they had made without being claimed or controlled by others. Comtrame. When Artemis drew her bow, she didn't simply aim and release. She brought together every element of what made her the perfect huntress, the divine embodiment of everything that hunting required and represented. The ancient poets gave her epithets that spoke to different aspects of her skill. Chrysolacatos meant of the golden arrow, emphasizing the divine perfection of her equipment. Iocara meant delighting in arrows, speaking to the joy she found in the practice of her craft. Theroscopos meant she who watches the beasts, capturing her deep knowledge of animal behavior and movement. But skill with a bow was only one element of what made her the mistress of the hunt. She understood tracking, how to read the signs that animals left in their passage through the wilderness, how to distinguish the prints of different creatures, how to determine their age and health and emotional state from the patterns they made on soft earth or in snow. Her hounds, those magnificent animals that Pan had given her, could track a stag by its footprints alone, could catch a hare in full flight, could bring down lions with their fierce coordination. She knew their capabilities intimately, understood how to work with them as partners, rather than simply commanding them as tools. She understood the rhythms of the wilderness itself, when different animals moved through different territories, how weather patterns affected their behavior, where water sources could be found even in the driest seasons. She could read the wind, using it to mask her scent or to carry information about what lay ahead. She knew which plants were safe to eat and which were poisonous, how to treat injuries in the field, how to move through dense underbrush without making sound or leaving obvious trails. The ancient hymns describe her traveling along the ridges of mountains, moving through terrain that would have been impossible for ordinary hunters. She could draw her bow while running at full speed, releasing arrows that struck their targets with perfect accuracy despite the difficulty of the shot. She could remain motionless for hours if necessary, her patience as perfect as her aim, waiting for the exact right moment to strike. And she could bring immediate death with her arrows, not the prolonged suffering of a poorly executed kill, but the clean precision of a shaft that found its mark and ended life as swiftly and mercifully as such an act could be done. This is important because it speaks to a fundamental respect for the animals she hunted. A skilled hunter doesn't cause unnecessary suffering. A skilled hunter understands that taking a life is a serious act, one that requires competence and concentration, and a kind of reverence for the creature whose existence is being ended. Artemis embodied this principle completely, and she expected the same standard from mortal hunters who moved through her domains. For Artemis, the wilderness wasn't simply a location or a backdrop for hunting activities. It was sacred space, a realm where different rules applied and where she held absolute authority. When mortals entered the forests and mountains that belonged to her, they were entering her temple, and they were expected to conduct themselves with the same reverence they would show in any sacred precinct. This meant understanding boundaries, both literal and metaphorical. There were places within the wilderness that were particularly holy to her, springs where she and her nymphs bathed, groves that served as gathering places for their dances, clearings where rituals were performed that no mortal eye should witness. Stumbling into these spaces accidentally might be forgiven if the intruder immediately retreated with appropriate respect. But deliberately seeking them out, or worse, remaining to spy on what was never meant to be seen, that brought down her legendary anger in its most devastating form. The story of Actaeon provides the clearest example of this principle in action. He was a skilled hunter, perhaps the most skilled of his generation, trained by the centaur Chiron himself in all the arts of the chase. But he made a fatal error. he spied upon the goddess as she was bathing with her nymphs at a spring. The ancient sources disagree about whether he stumbled upon the scene by accident or sought it out deliberately, but they agree completely about what happened next. Artemis transformed him into a stag and his own hounds, the animals he had trained and hunted with, who knew his scent and his voice, no longer recognized him as their master. They tore him apart, hunting him down with the same fierce efficiency they had shown in pursuing other prey. This punishment seems cruel by our modern standards, perhaps excessive for what might have been an honest mistake. But the ancient Greeks understood it differently. Actaeon had violated sacred space, had seen what no mortal was permitted to see, had looked upon the goddess in a moment of vulnerability and privacy. The transformation into a stag and the death by his own hounds represented a profound irony. The hunter becoming the hunted, the violation of boundaries resulting in the complete destruction of identity. But there's another layer to this story that's worth considering. Artemis bathed in wild springs, surrounded by her nymphs, unclothed and completely free, in a way that would have been impossible in civilized spaces, where women's bodies were subject to constant scrutiny and control. In the wilderness, away from the male gaze and the social structures that limited female autonomy, she could simply exist without armor or pretense. When Actaeon looked upon her, he was violating not just her privacy, but the fundamental principle of her existence, the right to move through the world on her own terms, free from being observed or judged or desired by those she had not invited into her presence. The wilderness that Artemis ruled was not a peaceful garden or a pastoral idyll designed for human comfort and aesthetic pleasure. It was a place of constant creation and destruction, where life and death existed in perpetual balance, where beauty and violence were woven together in patterns that seemed contradictory only to those who didn't understand the deeper logic. Homer, in the Iliad, describes her wild and darker side, with Hera accusing her of being a lioness between women, emphasizing her fierce and sometimes terrifying nature. This wasn't an insult, though Hera intended it as one. It was an acknowledgement of power, of the dangerous edge that existed in Artemis's character alongside her grace and skill. A lioness protects her territory and her pride with absolute ferocity, showing no mercy to threats. A lioness hunts with devastating efficiency, taking down prey much larger than herself through combination of strategy and strength. And a lioness answers to no one, moving through her world with a confidence that comes from being perfectly adapted to her environment. Artemis could bring immediate death with her arrows, striking down those who displeased her with the same precision she used in hunting. The ancient sources tell us that she and Apollo were bringers of sudden death and disease. She targeted women and girls, while her twin brother targeted men and boys. This seems cruel until you understand how the ancient Greeks conceptualized sudden death. A swift death, one that came without warning or prolonged suffering, was seen as a kind of mercy. It was far preferable to the slow decline of wasting illness or the agony of injury that couldn't heal. But she wasn't only destruction. She was also the protector of the girl child up to the age of marriage, watching over young women during that vulnerable period when they were developing their identities and their strength. She was a goddess of childbirth, called upon by women in labor because she understood that transition between non-existence and being, having experienced it herself in that remarkable moment on Delos when she entered the world without causing her mother pain. Poor. What makes Artemis's role as goddess of the wilderness so significant isn't simply that she was skilled at hunting, or that she protected certain animals, or that she punished those who violated her sacred spaces. What makes it significant is that every element of her identity came from choices she made rather than roles assigned to her. More. She chose the mountains over the cities. She chose the company of wild creatures and nymphs who shared her values over the politics and obligations of Olympus. She chose skill and strength and freedom over the conventional path of marriage and motherhood that defined most female existence in the ancient world, and she chose to define herself through her own actions and accomplishments rather than through her relationships to male figures. Nymph. When she roamed the forests and mountains with her bow and her hounds, when she tracked prey across impossible terrain and released arrows that flew true, when she protected her sacred spaces and her chosen companions with fierce determination, she was living according to the vision she had articulated as a 3-year-old child sitting in Zeus's lap. She had asked for the freedom to be herself, and she had spent every moment since then proving that she knew exactly who that self was and what it required. The ancient poets and artists returned to her again and again, depicting her as a young and vigorous goddess with her bow and quiver, sometimes accompanied by animals, moving through wild landscapes with perfect confidence. They called her by many names, as she had requested. Potneotheron, the mistress of animals, Eliphebelos, the stag killer, Chrysolikatos, she of the golden arrow, and dozens of others that spoke to different aspects of her power and her presence. But underneath all those names and all those stories was a consistent truth. Artemis was the goddess who chose freedom over safety, wilderness over civilization, autonomy over the conventional rewards that women were taught to desire. And in making that choice and living it completely, she created a legacy that would echo across thousands of years, offering an alternative vision of what female divinity could look like. Powerful not through relationships to others, but through relationship to herself and to the wild places where she felt most completely alive. The mountains still wait, timeless and patient, holding the memory of her footsteps across their slopes and the echo of her arrows finding their marks. The forests still whisper of her passage, of the nymphs who danced there, and the hounds who ran with perfect coordination through underbrush and over streams. And the wilderness itself, that sacred space that exists beyond human control and human understanding, remains hers, a testament to the goddess who understood that true power comes not from dominating others, but from knowing exactly who you are, and refusing to compromise that knowledge for anyone or anything. There's a moment that deserves our attention, one that happened on the island of Delos in the seconds after Artemis first opened her eyes on this world. She was a newborn goddess, divine, yes, but still in her first breath of existence, and the very first thing she witnessed was her mother's pain. Leto's labour had been 9 days and 9 nights of agony because Hera had kidnapped Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, keeping her locked away on Mount Olympus where she couldn't ease the suffering of Zeus's pregnant lover. And Artemis, newly born and already conscious in that way that divine beings are from their first moment, looked at her mother's twisted face and understood something profound. Childbirth was both miraculous and terrible, a threshold moment where life and death existed in such close proximity that a single misstep could tip the balance in either direction. Without hesitation, without even learning language or the complex rules of divinity first, Artemis reached for her mother and helped guide her twin brother Apollo into the world. In that act, that immediate, instinctive response to another being's suffering, she became a midwife before she became anything else. And from that moment forward, across thousands of years and countless stories, she would carry that role with her, becoming one of the primary goddesses of childbirth and midwifery alongside Eileithyia and Hera. The ancient Greeks understood something we sometimes forget in our modern compartmentalization of women's experiences. There's no inherent contradiction between being a virgin goddess and being a protector of childbirth. Both roles fall under the same domain, the wild, untamed, raw nature of female existence outside the boundaries of male control. Childbirth is fundamentally a wild act, no matter how much civilization tries to contain it or make it palatable. It's bloody and painful and intense, and in those moments all the social norms and proper behavior fall away, leaving only the woman, her body, and the child trying to enter the world. In that sacred, dangerous space, Artemis was present. Women in ancient Greece called upon Artemis when their time came, speaking her name alongside prayers to Aletheia, asking for protection and for the kind of swift, painless delivery that the goddess herself had experienced. The Orphic hymn addresses her directly. Artemis, Aletheia, venerable power, who bringest relief in labour's dreadful hour, hear, Prothyria, and make the infant race thy constant care. This wasn't empty flattery or poetic exaggeration. This was desperation given voice, the recognition that childbirth in the ancient world was one of the most dangerous experiences a woman could face. Joel. Without modern medicine, without antibiotics or surgical intervention, or even basic understanding of sterile technique, women died in childbirth with heartbreaking regularity. Infants died before drawing their first breath, or minutes after, or days later, from complications that no one understood how to treat. Every pregnancy was a gamble, every labour a journey into territory where even the strongest, healthiest woman might not return. In that context, having a goddess who understood the process intimately, who had witnessed it from the inside, so to speak, and who had the power to ease suffering, was not just comforting but essential. Artemis was worshipped with epithets that spoke to this protective function: Chorotrophos, the child-nurturing one; Paidotrophos, the protector of children; Philomyrax, the one who loves young girls. These weren't casual titles handed out by poets looking for variety in their verses. These were names that reflected how people actually related to her, what they asked of her, what they believed she could provide. But here's where the goddess becomes complicated again, where we have to hold two seemingly contradictory truths simultaneously. Artemis was the protector of women in childbirth, but it was also said that her arrows brought sudden death to women and girls, particularly during labour. She could bring both good health and illness upon women and children, sending relief or sending suffering according to some divine logic that mortals couldn't always understand or predict. This seems cruel until you consider what sudden death meant in the ancient understanding. A swift death, one that came without warning or prolonged agony, was actually a kind of mercy. If a woman was going to die in childbirth, if the baby was positioned wrong, if there was bleeding that couldn't be stopped, if infection was setting in, then dying quickly from one of Artemis's arrows was far preferable to days or weeks of fevered suffering, watching your body fail while helpless midwives tried remedies that wouldn't work. The goddess who could ease pain could also end it, and both actions fell under the umbrella of protection when viewed through that ancient lens. Artemis's protection extended beyond the moment of birth itself. She was the guardian of the girl child from infancy through to the age of marriage, watching over that entire developmental period when girls were becoming themselves, discovering their strength and their voices and their place in the world. Her twin brother Apollo held the same role for boys, but Artemis claimed the girls specifically, those beings who would eventually face the transformation from maiden to wife, from autonomous individual to someone defined by her relationship to husband and children. This was a liminal space, a threshold period that the ancient Greeks understood as both precious and dangerous. Young girls had not yet been tamed by marriage. They were still wild in a sense, still belonging primarily to themselves rather than to the patriarchal structures that would eventually claim them. Artemis, who had chosen to remain in that state of wildness forever, became their natural protector during this brief window when they shared her essential nature. In cities across the ancient Greek world, rituals emerged that honoured this relationship between the goddess and young girls. In Athens, girls between the ages of 5 and 10 served as arctoid little bears at the sanctuary of Artemis at Brauron, performing rituals that prepared them for the transition into womanhood. The bear was one of Artemis's sacred animals, powerful and fierce and protective of its young, and by taking on that identity temporarily, the girls were claiming a piece of the goddess's wild strength for themselves. These weren't gentle, decorative ceremonies designed to teach girls how to be proper wives and mothers. These were initiations into the realities of female existence, the power of their bodies, the dangers they would face, the strength they would need to survive childbirth and motherhood, and the 1,000 other challenges that awaited them. And Artemis presided over these transitions, fierce and protective, ensuring that the girls who passed through her rituals carried something of her wildness with them even after they entered into the domesticated life of marriage. The goddess's protection was particularly strong during these vulnerable years because she understood something fundamental. Young girls were targets in a world where male desire and male power often overrode questions of consent or appropriateness. Her own nymphs, those companions who had chosen to follow her path of eternal maidenhood, faced constant threats from gods who wanted to possess them, who saw their commitment to chastity as a challenge to be overcome rather than a choice to be respected. The stories of Artemis's nymphs aren't just entertaining myths about divine drama. They're narratives about violation and protection, about the constant tension between female autonomy and male entitlement. Callisto was one of Artemis's most beloved companions, a nymph who had sworn the same oath of eternal virginity that all the goddess's followers took. Zeus, in his typical fashion, decided he wanted her, and when she refused him, he disguised himself as Artemis herself. Taking on the goddess's form to get close to Callisto, to embrace her in what should have been a safe, intimate moment between companions. The violation was discovered when Callisto became pregnant, her body betraying what had been done to her. And Artemis. This is where the story becomes difficult, where we have to confront the less comfortable aspects of the goddess transformed Callisto into a bear and drove her away from the group. Some versions say Artemis killed her outright with her arrows. Either way, the punishment seems monstrously unfair to modern sensibilities. Callisto had been raped through deception, had lost her virginity against her will, and was now being punished by the very goddess who should have protected her. But the ancient understanding of purity and pollution operated differently than our modern concepts of blame and victimhood. Callisto's violated state, regardless of how it came about, meant she could no longer remain within the sacred circle of maiden companions. The oath had been broken, even if not by her choice, and the integrity of the group depended on that boundary remaining absolute. It's a harsh logic, one that places the burden on the victim rather than the perpetrator, and it speaks to the impossible standards that women faced in maintaining their reputations and their place in sacred spaces. Yet there's another reading of these stories that deserves consideration. Artemis's fierce protection of her nymph's virginity, her absolute intolerance for any violation of that oath, whether voluntary or forced, sent a clear message about the seriousness of her commitment to female autonomy. In a world where gods routinely raped mortal women and faced no consequences, where male desire was treated as a natural force that women simply had to accommodate, Artemis's territory was different. The mountains and forests that belonged to her operated under her rules, and those rules centered female choice and female bodily autonomy in ways that were radical for the ancient world. The price of that protection was absolute adherence to the standards she set. There could be no compromise, no nuance, no accommodation of individual circumstances if the fundamental principle was going to hold. It's a devastating trade-off, and the stories of Callisto and other nymphs who lost Artemis's protection carry genuine tragedy in them. But they also demonstrate the goddess's recognition that maintaining spaces where women could exist outside male control required constant vigilance and uncompromising boundaries. Modern readers often stumble over the question that ancient sources also found intriguing: how could a virgin goddess be a protector of childbirth? How could someone who had never given birth herself, who had actively chosen to never experience pregnancy or motherhood, understand what labouring women needed? The answer lies in that first moment on Delos, when Artemis entered the world and immediately served as midwife to her twin brother's birth. She witnessed childbirth from a unique perspective, not as the one giving birth, but as the helper, the attendant, the one whose role was to ease the process and ensure safe passage for both mother and child. This perspective gave her a different kind of understanding, one focused on protection and assistance rather than the experience of being the mother herself. Moreover, her virginity, her eternal choice to remain outside the structures of marriage and motherhood, gave her a kind of objectivity and distance that goddesses who had their own children might not have possessed. She wasn't protecting pregnant women because she identified with them or because their experience mirrored her own. She was protecting them because she understood that childbirth represented the most vulnerable moment in a woman's life, when her body was consumed by forces beyond her control, when she needed divine protection more desperately than at any other time. The ancient poet who wrote the Orphic hymn seemed to understand this distinction, calling her venerable power, who bringest relief in labour's dreadful hour. Not mother, not fellow sufferer, but power, a force that stood outside the experience itself, and could therefore act upon it with divine effectiveness. There's also a deeper layer to this paradox that speaks to Artemis's fundamental nature. She was the goddess of liminality, of threshold moments and transitions. Birth is the ultimate threshold, the transition from non-existence to existence, from the darkness of the womb to the light of the world. Artemis had crossed that threshold herself, with unusual consciousness and awareness, emerging without causing her mother pain, understanding from her first moment what had happened and what was happening. She was perfectly positioned to help others make that same crossing, whether as infants being born or as mothers giving birth. The nymphs who accompanied Artemis, those 50 daughters of Oceanus who sang for her, and the 20 nymphs from the woods who tended her equipment, represented a kind of chosen family, a community of women who had opted out of conventional female roles to create something different. They hunted together, danced together in mountain clearings, bathed in sacred springs, and performed rituals that no mortal eye was permitted to witness. These nymphs appeared during festivals of marriage, which seems paradoxical given their own commitment to remaining unmarried. But their presence at these occasions spoke to something important. They witnessed and blessed the transition of young girls into wives, even though they themselves would never make that transition. They were the last representatives of the wild, autonomous self that the bride was leaving behind, and their blessing acknowledged both the significance of that loss and the hope that something of that wildness might be carried forward into married life. Pregnant women appealed to the nymphs as well as to Artemis herself, asking for their intercession and protection during the dangerous months of carrying a child and the even more dangerous hours of giving birth. The ancient sources tell us that women consecrated clothes to Artemis for a happy childbirth, hanging them in her temples as both prayer and offering, as if the fabric itself could carry their desperate hopes for survival. Artemis was worshipped with the surname Euclea in several cities, the glorious one, she of good repute, and in this form she became particularly associated with marriage and childbirth, with the hope that young brides would find happiness and safety in their new lives. It's remarkable when you think about it. The goddess who had famously refused marriage herself, who had asked Zeus as a 3-year-old child to grant her eternal virginity so she would never be subject to a husband's control, became the one that brides and pregnant women turned to for protection and blessing. What made Artemis an effective protector of women and children wasn't that she identified with their choices or celebrated their roles. It was that she understood, with perfect clarity, what those choices cost. She had witnessed her mother's suffering on Delos, 9 days and 9 nights of labour that wouldn't progress because Hera had stolen away the goddess who could help. She had seen what it meant to be pregnant and vulnerable and hunted across continents, refused shelter everywhere because other lands feared divine retribution. Number. She had made her choice to refuse that path, to ask her father for the freedom to remain a maiden forever, to never subject her body to pregnancy or her autonomy to a husband's authority. But having made that choice didn't blind her to the reality that other women, mortal and divine, would make different choices or have those choices made for them. And in those moments when women faced the consequences of fertility and childbearing, when their bodies became battlegrounds and their lives hung in the balance, Artemis was there. The ancient temples to Artemis were often built near springs, marshes, and rivers, places where water flowed and life flourished, where the nymphs lived, and where pregnant women came to make their prayers. These weren't the grand marble structures in city centres, where civic rituals took place under the eyes of male priests and politicians. These were wilder spaces, places that belonged to women and to the natural forces that governed fertility and birth. To fix the women would come to these springs, sometimes alone, sometimes with midwives or female relatives, and they would speak to the goddess in words that weren't recorded because men weren't present to write them down. They would ask for safe delivery, for healthy babies, for the strength to survive the ordeal ahead. They would promise offerings if their prayers were answered, clothes for the goddess, statuettes depicting mothers with infants, dedications that spoke to the depth of their fear and their hope. And Artemis, the virgin huntress who roamed the mountains with her bow and her hounds, would listen. She would extend her protection over these labouring women, these vulnerable infants, these young girls growing into awareness of what their futures held. Not because she wanted to be like them, not because she celebrated their choices, but because she understood that they deserved protection regardless of the path they walked. But when Artemis's arrows found women and girls bringing sudden death and disease, as the ancient sources tell us, it wasn't always punishment or divine caprice. Sometimes, perhaps more often than the stories make explicit, it was mercy. A woman dying slowly from childbed fever, her body consumed by infection, watching her newborn infant being taken away because she could no longer nurse it safely. A young girl facing a future of abuse or forced marriage to a man old enough to be her grandfather. A child suffering from disease that no healer could treat, that would only grow more painful as days passed. Artemis's arrows brought swift death, sudden, unexpected, without prolonged suffering. In a world before modern medicine, before pain management or understanding of how to treat most illnesses, that swiftness was genuinely merciful. The ancient Greeks understood this in ways we sometimes don't, having largely removed death from our daily experience and hidden it away in hospitals and hospices. They knew that death itself was inevitable for mortals, and that how one died mattered tremendously. Numbers. So when women prayed to Artemis, they weren't just asking for successful childbirth or healthy children. They were also asking, implicitly, that if death came, if something went wrong that couldn't be fixed, if suffering became unbearable, that the goddess would grant them the mercy of her arrows rather than the slow agony of prolonged dying. It was a dark blessing, but a blessing nonetheless, from a goddess who understood that protection sometimes meant ending suffering rather than extending life. The first act of Artemis's conscious existence was to help her mother, to ease the birth of her twin brother, to stand in the role of midwife and attendant even though she had just entered the world herself. That moment defined something essential about who she would be across all the thousands of years of stories and worship that followed. Number. She was fierce and wild, yes. The huntress who roamed mountains with her bow and her hounds, who punished those who violated her boundaries with legendary wrath. But she was also the helper, the protector, the one who understood what it meant to witness suffering and choose to alleviate it. She extended that protection to women in their most vulnerable moments, to children in their fragile early years, to young girls navigating the dangerous transition from childhood to womanhood. The ancient hymns called her Korotrophos, the child, nurturing one, and that epithet captured something crucial about the complexity of her nature. She nurtured not by becoming a mother herself, not by taking on the domestic role that defined most female divinity in the Greek pantheon, but by fiercely protecting the autonomy and safety of those who were vulnerable. She created and maintained spaces, both physical and metaphorical, where women and children could exist with some measure of safety from the threats that surrounded them. Women in labour called her name alongside Eileithyia, asking for the protection that only divine power could provide. Young girls served as her little bears at Brauron, taking on her wildness temporarily before entering into the tamed life of marriage. Midwives invoked her aid when deliveries became dangerous and conventional skill wasn't enough. And in all these moments, across all these centuries, Artemis remained what she had been from her first conscious breath, the helper who understood the cost of female existence, who protected those who needed protection, and who demanded respect for the boundaries and autonomy of those who fell under her care. The virgin goddess who helped birth her twin brother became the protector of all births, all vulnerable children, all girls growing into women. Not because she wanted to be like them, but because she had witnessed suffering in her first moment of existence and chosen to act against it. That choice, made before language or identity or the complex rules of divinity had been learned, remained constant across all the ages that followed. A testament to the power of that first decision to help, to protect, to use her divine gifts in service of those who needed them most. There's something that needs to be understood about divine anger before we dive into the stories of those who crossed Artemis and paid for it with their lives, their sanity, or their very forms. The gods of ancient Greece weren't benevolent moral authorities dispensing justice according to some universal ethical code. They were powerful beings with their own territories, their own boundaries, and their own expectations of respect and worship. When mortals violated those boundaries, when they trespassed into sacred spaces, when they showed hubris or disrespect, when they forgot that the natural world belonged to forces far more powerful than themselves, the consequences were swift and devastating. Artemis's anger wasn't random or capricious, though mortals who suffered it might have felt otherwise. She punished specific violations, threats to her virginity and the virginity of her companions, disrespect toward her mother Leto, hubris in hunting, or boasts of superiority, failure to offer proper worship and sacrifice. These weren't arbitrary rules invented to catch mortals in traps. They were the fundamental principles that governed her existence and her domain, and she defended them with the same fierce determination she brought to protecting young girls and women in labor. The stories of her vengeance are written in blood and transformation, in bodies twisted into new forms and lives ended with silver arrows that flew too true to dodge. They're uncomfortable stories, often brutal in their conclusions, and they reveal a side of the goddess that exists in tension with her role as protector and helper. But that tension is essential to understanding who she was. Not a one-dimensional figure of nurturing femininity or savage wilderness, but a complex divine being whose protection came with absolute requirements and whose mercy had clear limits. The story of Actaeon has been told and retold for thousands of years, depicted on countless vases, and discussed by poets and philosophers trying to understand what it meant. The basic facts are consistent across most ancient sources. Actaeon was a skilled hunter, perhaps the most skilled of his generation, trained by the centaur Chiron himself in all the arts of the chase. He knew the wilderness intimately, understood animal behavior, could track prey across impossible terrain with the kind of expertise that should have made him reverent of the goddess who ruled those wild spaces. Yeni. But on one particular day, while hunting with his companions in the forests near Thebes, Actaeon made a fatal error. He came upon a spring hidden deep in a grove, a place where sunlight filtered through ancient trees and the water ran so clear you could count the pebbles on the bottom. And there, in that secluded sacred space, Artemis was bathing with her nymphs. The ancient sources disagree about whether Actaeon stumbled upon the scene accidentally or sought it out deliberately, whether he was a victim of unfortunate timing or a voyeur who got what he deserved. Some versions suggest he simply wandered into the wrong grove at the wrong moment, his hunter's footsteps too quiet, his approach unnoticed until he had already seen what no mortal was permitted to see. Other versions claim he deliberately spied on the goddess, hiding behind trees to watch her unclothed form, violating her privacy with intention and awareness. But the result, was the same regardless of his motivation. Artemis looked up and saw him there, this mortal man looking upon her naked body, upon the bodies of her nymphs, upon a moment that should have been completely private and protected from the male gaze. Her face twisted with rage, and in some versions she splashed water from the spring directly at him, the droplets transforming as they struck his skin. Actaeon began to change. His body twisted and reshaped itself, bones cracking and reforming, skin sprouting coarse hair, hands and feet hardening into hooves. Antlers burst from his skull, branching and spreading until they resembled the rack of a mature stag. His face elongated, jaw restructuring itself, and when he tried to cry out in horror at what was happening to him, the sound that emerged was the frightened bleat of a deer. The transformation was complete in moments, and Actaeon, still possessing his human mind and consciousness, but trapped in an animal form, stumbled away from the spring on legs that no longer felt like his own. He ran through the forest he had hunted in countless times before, but now he was the prey rather than the predator. And behind him, growing closer with every moment, came the sound of baying hounds, his own hunting dogs, the animals he had raised and trained, who knew his scent and his voice, but no longer recognized him as their master. They caught him in a clearing, these dogs who had loved him and obeyed him and hunted beside him for years. But all they could see was a stag prey to be brought down, meat to be torn apart. Actaeon tried to speak, tried to make them understand who he was, but his voice came out as animal sounds that meant nothing to them. The first dog leapt for his throat, and then the rest of the pack descended upon him, tearing and ripping with the same fierce efficiency they had shown in bringing down other prey. The ancient sources tell us that Actaeon's hunting companions, the men who had been with him in the forest that day, heard the commotion and came running, thinking their friend had made a spectacular kill. They arrived to find his dogs in a frenzy over the body of a stag they had torn to pieces, and they called out for Actaeon to come see what his magnificent animals had accomplished. They never knew that the stag's eyes had held human consciousness and human terror, that their friend had died in one of the most horrible ways imaginable, killed by his own beloved dogs, his identity stripped away, his skill and knowledge rendered useless by a transformation he couldn't control. This is what happened when you violated Artemis's sacred spaces, when you looked upon what was never meant to be seen. The punishment fit the crime with devastating irony. The hunter became the hunted, the master was killed by his own animals, the one who had moved through the wilderness with confidence and skill died terrified and helpless. And the message was clear to anyone who heard the story. The wilderness belonged to Artemis, and those who entered it were guests in her territory, subject to her rules and her judgment. Orion's story is more complicated than Actaeon's, more tangled in its various versions and interpretations, and the relationship between the great hunter and the goddess remains one of the most debated aspects of Artemis's mythology. Some sources suggest they were friends and hunting companions, that Orion was one of the few mortals who could keep pace with the goddess through the forests and mountains, whose skill with bow and spear came close to matching her own divine prowess. Other versions hint at something more, that Orion loved Artemis, or that she loved him, or that they shared some connection that transcended the usual gulf between divine and mortal. But what all the versions agree on is this: Orion died because of Artemis, and his death was written in the stars themselves as a warning and a memorial. B.E. Orion was a giant of a man, a hunter of legendary skill, who boasted that he could kill every animal on Earth if he chose to do so. This was hubris of the most dangerous kind. Not just pride in one's abilities, but a claim of supremacy that directly challenged the natural order that Artemis protected. The wilderness wasn't a resource for mortals to exploit without limit, wasn't a playground where hunters could demonstrate their superiority by slaughtering everything they encountered. It was a sacred space where life and death existed in balance, where hunting was acceptable, but wholesale destruction was an abomination. In some versions of the tale, Gaia, the earth herself, heard Orion's boast and was so offended that she sent a scorpion to kill him. The creature pursued the great hunter across the earth, its venomous sting eventually finding its mark and bringing down even someone of Orion's size and strength. Artemis, in this version, simply allowed it to happen, withdrawing her protection from someone who had so profoundly violated the principles she held sacred. But other versions give Artemis a more active role in Orion's death. Some say that Orion attempted to rape one of her companions, or attempted to rape the goddess herself, and she sent the scorpion as direct punishment for that violation. The scorpion in these versions isn't a tool of Gaia's vengeance, but Artemis's own instrument of retribution, hunting Orion with the same relentless focus that he had brought to hunting animals. There's yet another version that's perhaps the most tragic of all, one that suggests Artemis's feelings for Orion were complicated enough that her brother Apollo felt the need to intervene. Apollo, according to this telling, was concerned that his sister might be compromising her eternal virginity, might be falling for this mortal hunter in ways that threatened her fundamental nature. So he challenged her to an archery contest, pointing to a distant object bobbing in the sea and betting that she couldn't hit it. Number 4. Artemis, confident in her skill and never one to back down from a challenge involving her bow, took careful aim and released her arrow. It flew true, striking the target perfectly. And only then did she discover that the distant object had been Orion swimming in the ocean, that her brother had tricked her into killing the mortal she cared for. In grief and rage, she placed Orion among the stars where he would be visible forever, hunting across the night sky with his belt and his sword, pursued eternally by the scorpion that was also placed among the constellations. To you, whichever version you choose to believe, and the ancient Greeks themselves couldn't seem to agree on which was correct, the essential truth remains the same. Orion crossed boundaries that should not have been crossed, and the result was death. Whether through hubris in boasting about slaughtering all animals, through attempted violation of sacred virginity, or simply through getting too close to a goddess who could never compromise her fundamental nature, he paid the ultimate price. The story of the Alladai, the twin giants, Otus and Ephialtes, represents perhaps the most audacious attempt to violate Artemis's boundaries and claim her against her will. These weren't ordinary mortals who stumbled into sacred spaces by accident or made foolish boasts in moments of pride. These were beings of enormous power, sons of Poseidon who grew at an impossible rate, 9 fathoms tall and 9 cubits wide by the time they were 9 years old. The Alladai had already proven themselves dangerous to the established order of the cosmos. They had imprisoned Ares, the god of war himself, stuffing him into a bronze jar where he languished for 13 months until Hermes finally freed him. They had threatened to stack mountains on top of each other, Pelion on top of Ossa, on top of Olympus itself, creating a tower that would allow them to storm the home of the gods and claim divine power for themselves. But their ambitions weren't purely about power and conquest. Otus declared that he desired Artemis as his wife, while his brother Ephialtes proclaimed his intention to claim Hera. They weren't asking permission or courting favor. They were announcing their intention to take what they wanted, to force 2 of the most powerful goddesses in the Greek pantheon into marriages that would fundamentally violate their natures. The audacity of this plan is staggering when you really consider it. Artemis had been granted eternal virginity by Zeus himself, had built her entire existence around the principle of autonomy and freedom from male control, had demonstrated repeatedly and violently what happened to those who threatened her bodily sovereignty. And these giants thought they could simply claim her, as if she were a prize to be won, rather than a divine being with her own will and power. Ma. Artemis's response was characteristically clever and devastating. She transformed herself into a white hind, a deer of such beauty and grace that both giants immediately lusted after it, forgetting their larger ambitions in their desire to capture this perfect creature. They pursued the hind through the wilderness, both giants certain that they would be the one to bring it down. And Artemis, in her deer form, positioned herself between them with perfect precision. Both Otus and Ephialtes drew their weapons, their spears or javelins depending on which version you read, and threw at the exact same moment, each aiming for the white deer that danced between them. But the deer was a goddess, faster and more agile than any mortal animal, and she vanished in the instant before the weapons arrived. The spears continued their trajectories, each one flying true toward where the hind had been, and each one finding a target in the giant on the opposite side. Otus's weapon struck Ephialtes, and Ephialtes' weapon struck Otus, and both giants fell, killed by their own throws, their arrogance and lust turned into instruments of their destruction. This was Artemis at her most strategically brilliant, using the giants' own desires and competitiveness against them, turning what should have been a moment of triumph into fratricide. She didn't need to face them in direct combat or appeal to more powerful gods for protection. She simply used their certainty that they could possess her, their conviction that she was an object to be claimed rather than a being with agency, and let that certainty destroy them. Not all of Artemis's vengeance targeted those who threatened her directly. Sometimes her arrows found their marks because of insults directed at her mother Leto, and the punishment for those insults was written in the bodies of innocent children. The story of Niobe provides the clearest and most devastating example of this pattern. Niobe was a queen of Thebes, wife of Amphion, and mother of 14 children, 7 sons and 7 daughters, all of them beautiful and accomplished, and the pride of their parents. In some versions the number varies, but the essential fact remains. Niobe had been blessed with many children, and she made the mistake of comparing herself favorably to Leto. 6th year. Why should I worship Leto? Niobe reportedly asked during a festival in the goddess's honor. She has only 2 children, while I have 7 sons and 7 daughters. Even if I were to lose some of my children, I would still have more than Leto. I am clearly more blessed, more favored by the gods, more deserving of worship than she is. This was hubris of the most dangerous kind. Not just pride in one's blessings, but a direct challenge to a goddess, a claim of superiority that demanded response. Leto heard the boast and was wounded by it, and her children. Apollo and Artemis, the divine twins who had been present at the most vulnerable moment of her existence, rushed to their mother's defense. They descended upon Thebes with their bows drawn and their divine anger fully aroused. Apollo took aim at Niobe's 7 sons, and one by one his golden arrows found their marks, striking down the young men with precision that allowed no escape. Artemis, with her silver bow, targeted the 7 daughters, her arrows flying with the same devastating accuracy her brother demonstrated. The daughters fell where they stood, in the palace, in the courtyard, some while trying to flee, some while embracing their dying brothers. The ancient sources describe Niobe rushing through the carnage, trying to protect her remaining children with her own body, begging the divine twins to spare at least one. In some versions, Artemis showed mercy and allowed the youngest daughter to survive, though other versions are more brutal and claim that all 14 children died within hours. Niobe's husband, Amphion, some sources say, killed himself in grief at the loss of his children and the knowledge that his wife's hubris had brought this catastrophe upon their house. Niobe herself was left standing among the bodies of her children. All those beautiful sons and daughters who had been her pride and her joy, now dead because she had compared herself favorably to a goddess. The punishment didn't end there. Niobe, consumed by grief so profound that she couldn't eat or drink or speak, was transformed into stone. Some versions say she was literally turned into a rock on Mount Sipylus, while others suggest she simply became like stone in her immobility and silence. And even in stone form she continued to weep, water streaming down the rock face like tears that would never stop falling, an eternal monument to the price of hubris and the consequences of insulting the gods. The story is brutal in its conclusion and deeply uncomfortable in its logic. The children did nothing wrong. They were innocent victims of their mother's pride, struck down by divine arrows because Niobe claimed superiority over Leto. But the ancient Greeks understood this differently than we might. The family was a unit, and the sins of parents were visited upon children as a matter of course. Moreover, Niobe's boast wasn't just personal pride. It was a religious offense, a failure to properly honor the gods, and such failures demanded correction that would be memorable enough to prevent others from making the same mistake. Artemis and Apollo were defending their mother, demonstrating to the mortal world that Leto, despite being a titaness who had been hunted across continents, despite having suffered 9 days of labor, despite Zeus's infidelity having marked her as a target for Hera's wrath, was still deserving of honor and respect. The twins had helped and protected her from their first moments of existence, and they continued that protection throughout their immortal lives, punishing any mortal who suggested that Leto was anything less than blessed. Sometimes, Artemis's vengeance came not from direct insults or violations, but from simple neglect, from mortals who forgot to include her in their sacrifices or who failed to honor her properly. The story of the Caledonian boar hunt illustrates how devastating the goddess's anger could be when directed at an entire kingdom. King Oeneus of Caledon made the mistake of offering the first fruits of his harvest to all the gods except Artemis. Whether this was deliberate disrespect or simple oversight varies depending on which version you read, but the result was the same. Artemis responded by sending a monstrous boar to ravage his kingdom, a creature of enormous size and vicious temperament that destroyed crops, killed livestock, and attacked any human who ventured too close. The Caledonian boar became legendary, and Oeneus was forced to call upon the greatest heroes of Greece to hunt it down. Jason came, and Theseus, and Castor and Pollux, and Atalanta, that fierce virgin huntress who was in many ways a mortal reflection of Artemis herself. The hunt was dangerous and costly, with several heroes dying in the attempt to bring down the creature. Miraculous. When the boar was finally killed, the victory sparked further conflict over who should receive the hide as trophy arguments that led to more deaths, including Oeneus's own son Meleager. The goddess's vengeance thus rippled out from the initial offense, causing cascading consequences that devastated families and kingdoms, all because one king forgot to honor her properly in his sacrifices. A similar pattern played out with Agamemnon, the great king who led the Greek forces to Troy. He offended Artemis, either by boasting that his hunting skills surpassed hers, or by killing one of her sacred deer, or by failing to fulfill a sacrifice promised by his father, depending on which version of the story you believe. The details vary, but the consequence was consistent. Artemis sent contrary winds that prevented the Greek fleet from sailing to Troy, stranding thousands of warriors and their ships at Alis for months. The prophet Calchas revealed that only one thing would appease the goddess and allow the winds to change. Agamemnon would have to sacrifice his own daughter, Iphigenia. The king faced an impossible choice: kill his child to fulfill his military obligations, or abandon the expedition and lose his authority among the Greeks. In the end, Agamemnon chose to proceed with the sacrifice. His daughter was brought to Alis under false pretenses, told she was to be married to Achilles when she was actually being led to the altar. But most versions of the myth suggest that Artemis showed mercy at the final moment. She substituted a deer for Iphigenia just as the knife was about to fall, spiriting the girl away to become a priestess in one of her temples far from Greece. This was a different kind of punishment than what happened to Actaeon or the Alauidae. Agamemnon didn't die. Instead, he was forced to live with the knowledge that he had been willing to kill his own daughter, that he had chosen military glory and political power over his child's life. And even though Iphigenia survived, she was taken from her family and her homeland, her future as a wife and mother, replaced with service to the goddess who had demanded her as sacrifice. What ties all these stories together? The hunter transformed into prey, the giants killed by their own weapons, the children struck down by silver arrows, the kingdoms ravaged by monstrous beasts, is the consistent principle of boundaries and their enforcement. Artemis had claimed her domains and defined her rules. The wilderness was sacred space, where human activity was permitted but never dominant. Virginity and bodily autonomy were absolute and inviolable. Proper worship and respect were required of all mortals who benefited from her protection. 2. When those boundaries were crossed, deliberately or accidentally, through arrogance or through simple neglect, the consequences were severe. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake or arbitrary displays of power. It was the enforcement of the fundamental principles that allowed her to exist as she had chosen to exist, free and autonomous and outside the control of others. The punishments were memorable, designed to serve as warnings to others who might be tempted to make similar violations. Actaeon's transformation and death by his own hounds warned against violating the goddess's privacy and looking upon what was never meant to be seen. The death of the Aloadai demonstrated that even beings of enormous power couldn't simply claim Artemis as a possession. Niobe's weeping stone showed what happened to those who insulted Leto, or suggested that the goddess and her mother were anything less than deserving of the highest honor. These stories were told and retold across centuries, depicted on vases and temple walls, recited by poets and discussed by philosophers. They became part of how ancient Greeks understood the natural world and humanity's place within it, not as masters or dominators, but as participants in a system that had its own rules and its own powerful guardians. Artemis's vengeance was fierce, yes, and often brutal in its execution. But it was also consistent and comprehensible, rooted in principles that she had articulated clearly and defended without compromise. She was the goddess who had asked her father for eternal maidenhood, for mountains as her sacred places, for the freedom to define herself entirely on her own terms. And having received those gifts, she spent her immortal existence ensuring that no one, mortal or divine, could take them away or compromise them through violation or disrespect. Prison. The silver arrows found their marks with devastating accuracy, and the wilderness maintained its sacred character, and the goddess remained what she had always been, wild and free and utterly unwilling to compromise the boundaries that made her existence possible. The companions who surrounded Artemis weren't random attendants assigned by divine decree, or servants compelled into service. They were beings who had chosen her path, who had embraced the same commitment to wildness and freedom that defined the goddess herself. When Artemis had made her childhood request to Zeus, sitting in her father's lap with that remarkable 3-year-old clarity about exactly what she wanted from a mortal existence, she had asked specifically for 60 daughters of Oceanus to form her choir, all 9 years old, all maidens yet ungirdled, and 20 nymphs from Amnisus, who would tend her hunting equipment and care for her swift hounds. These weren't decorative additions to make her court more impressive, or servants to handle tasks beneath divine attention. They were the foundation of a community built on shared values and mutual choice, a fellowship of the wild that operated according to principles radically different from the structures that governed most female existence in the ancient world. The ancient poet Callimachus describes how the young Artemis travelled to the white mountain of Crete, leafy with woods, and from there to Oceanus himself to personally select her companions. The river Ceratus was glad exceedingly, and glad was Tethys that they were sending their daughters to be handmaidens to the daughter of Leto. There's something remarkable in this image. The goddess as a child, already knowing exactly what she needed, travelling to claim the companions who would hunt and dance and sing with her across the millennia that followed. These 60 daughters of Oceanus formed Artemis's choir, young and wild and free in ways that most beings never experienced. The ancient sources describe them as 9 years old, not in the sense of powerless children, but in that liminal space before marriage and domestication, before the girdle that symbolized a woman's readiness for sexual maturity had been fastened around their waists. They were eternally suspended in that moment of wildness, that brief window when girls belonged primarily to themselves rather than to fathers or husbands. Their names suggest they were Nephili, cloud nymphs, beings made of mist and mountain air, as ephemeral and untouchable as the wilderness itself. They sang for Artemis as she hunted, their voices rising in harmonies that seemed to merge with the sounds of wind through pine branches and the rush of mountain streams. They danced with her in forest clearings, where no mortal eye was permitted to witness, their movements echoing the patterns of deer leaping across meadows and hawks circling overhead. Homer describes a scene that captures the essence of this fellowship. Artemis, standing in her golden chariot after bathing in the gentle water of Parthenius, or the streams of Amnesis, driving off with her fast-trotting deer over the hills to some rich-scented sacrifice. Attendant nymphs gathered at the source of Amnesis, or flocked in from the glens and upland springs to follow her, and fawning beasts whimpered in homage and trembled as she passed by. This wasn't a procession of power in the conventional sense, not soldiers marching in formation or subjects bowing to a queen. It was something wilder and more joyful, a celebration of movement and freedom, and the sheer pleasure of existing outside the boundaries that constrained others. The nymphs who tended Artemis's equipment, those 20 from Amnesis who kept her buskins polished and her bowstring strong, weren't simply maintenance workers. They were essential partners in the hunt, beings who understood that caring for the tools of the chase was itself a sacred act. A bow that wasn't properly maintained wouldn't shoot true, and arrows with damaged fletching wouldn't fly straight. These nymphs ensured that when Artemis drew her weapon, it would perform perfectly, that the skill she had developed over countless millennia wouldn't be compromised by faulty equipment. Among Artemis's companions, 3 held particularly sacred status: the Hyperborean maidens, Olympus, Hecate, and Loxo. These beings came from the mythical northern land of Hyperborea, that impossible place beyond the north wind where the sun shone eternally and death and disease were unknown. They had travelled to Delos in the distant past, bringing offerings to honour the place where Artemis and Apollo had been born. But they died there on the island. How divine or semi-divine beings from an immortal land could die is never fully explained in the sources, but the ancient Greeks accepted this paradox without demanding logical consistency. Artemis granted them a kind of secondary immortality, transforming them into eternal attendants who would never leave her service. They became her most trusted companions, the ones who helped her with the sacred rituals that defined her worship. When the goddess leapt from her chariot, Olympus took the bow from her shoulders, and her carriage took the quiver. The daughters of Oceanus removed the well-strung hunting nets, and Loxo loosed the boots from her feet. This wasn't servitude in any degrading sense. It was participation in the intimate rituals of a divine being, trusted access to moments of vulnerability and transition that outsiders would never witness. The Hyperborean maidens represented something important about the nature of Artemis's fellowship. It transcended death itself. Once you became her companion, once you committed to her path and her principles, that bond extended beyond the normal boundaries of mortal existence. The maidens who died on Delos were transformed rather than lost, made permanent rather than temporary, granted the gift of eternal service to a goddess who valued their devotion. Not all of Artemis's companions were nymphs or divine beings. Some were mortal women who had earned the goddess's respect through their skill and their commitment to the same principles of autonomy and wilderness that defined her existence. Atalanta stands out as perhaps the most famous of these mortal companions, a huntress whose legend rivals even the goddess's own in some respects. Atalanta had been abandoned as an infant by her father, who wanted sons rather than daughters, a heartbreakingly common occurrence in the ancient world where female children were often seen as burdens rather than blessings. But instead of dying in the wilderness where she had been left, Atalanta was suckled by a she-bear, that fierce animal sacred to Artemis herself. When she grew old enough to fend for herself, she was discovered by hunters who raised her in the ways of the wilderness, teaching her tracking and archery and all the skills she would need to survive. Artemis took notice of this young woman who had been raised by her sacred animal, who moved through the forests with the kind of confidence and capability that most mortals never achieved. The goddess commended swift-footed Atalanta and taught her hunting with dogs and good archery, elevating her skills to levels that would make her legendary among mortals. Atalanta hunted with Artemis's band, running with nymphs and divine beings as if she belonged among them, and perhaps in the truest sense, she did. She participated in the Caledonian boar hunt, that massive expedition where the greatest heroes of Greece gathered to bring down the monstrous creature Artemis had sent to punish King Oeneus. Atalanta struck the boar first, drawing first blood before the male heroes could claim that honor, demonstrating that female skill and courage were equal to or greater than their masculine counterparts. Like Artemis herself, Atalanta resisted marriage for as long as she could, setting impossible challenges for her suitors, demanding that they race against her and die if they lost, ensuring that only someone truly exceptional could claim her as wife. Eventually, she was tricked into marriage through divine intervention and magical means, but during her years as a virgin huntress, she embodied everything that Artemis represented: freedom, skill, courage, and the refusal to accept limitations based on gender or social expectation. Lt. Callisto represents a different and more tragic pattern among Artemis's mortal companions. She was a princess of Arcadia who joined the goddess's band, swearing the oath of eternal virginity that all companions were required to take. She hunted with Artemis and her nymphs, proving her skill and her commitment to the path she had chosen. But Zeus noticed her beauty and desired her, and when she refused his advances, he disguised himself as Artemis to get close to her. The rape itself, because that's what it was, regardless of the disguise or deception involved, violated everything that Callisto's oath represented. She became pregnant, her body betraying what had been done to her, and when Artemis discovered the pregnancy during a communal bathing, she was enraged. The goddess transformed Callisto into a bear and drove her from the group, or in some versions killed her outright with her silver arrows. Callisto's son Arcas was saved and raised separately, and years later, when he had become a hunter himself, he nearly killed his mother in bear form before Zeus intervened and placed them both among the stars as Ursa Major and Ursa Minor. The tragedy of Callisto's story lies in its fundamental injustice. She was punished for violation that wasn't her fault, driven away from the community she had chosen because Zeus's desire overrode her consent and her oath. But it also demonstrates the absolute nature of Artemis's standards. The oath was sacred. The community's integrity depended on every member maintaining that commitment, and even sympathetic circumstances couldn't override the fundamental requirement. The creatures that surrounded Artemis and inhabited her sacred spaces weren't ordinary animals subject to natural laws and mortal limitations. They were beings that carried something of her essence within them, that moved through the world with qualities that transcended normal animal existence. The deer she drove in her golden chariot had antlers made of precious metal, and they pulled her faster than any mortal horse could run. The hounds that Pan had given her could track prey by footprints alone and catch anything that ran. But among all her sacred animals, one stands above the rest in terms of legend and significance: the Ceryneian hind, also called the golden hind. This creature was extraordinary in multiple ways. It had golden antlers like a stag despite being female, and it possessed hooves of bronze that allowed it to run faster than arrows could fly. Some sources say it was sacred to Artemis from birth, while others claim it had been transformed into this magical form as punishment or protection. The hind lived on Mount Cyrenea in Arcadia, that wild mountainous region that was particularly sacred to Artemis. It roamed freely through forests and across meadows, belonging to no one but the goddess herself. Its very existence represented the principle that some things in the natural world were inviolable, that not everything could be hunted or claimed or possessed by mortals regardless of their skill or determination. Heracles learned this lesson during his third labour, when King Eurystheus commanded him to capture the Ceryneian hind and bring it back alive. This task seemed straightforward enough for the greatest hero of Greece. Surely someone who had strangled serpents in his cradle and slain the Nemean lion could capture a single deer. But the hind proved impossible to catch, running faster than Heracles could follow, leaving no tracks he could use to predict its movements. The pursuit lasted an entire year. Heracles tracked the creature through Arcadia, across the land of the Hyperboreans, through territories that existed on the edge of the mythical world. He saw the hind countless times but could never get close enough to capture it without harming it, and he knew that injuring Artemis's sacred animal would bring down divine wrath that even he might not survive. Finally, when the creature paused to drink at a stream, Heracles managed to shoot an arrow that pinned its forelegs together without drawing blood, a shot of such precision that it rivals any feat of archery in Greek mythology. He caught the hind and began carrying it back to Mycenae to present to Eurystheus, but Artemis intercepted him on the road, accompanied by her brother Apollo, and the goddess's anger was immediate and terrible. "How dare you touch my sacred animal?" she demanded, her hand moving to her bow. "You know this creature belongs to me, that it is inviolable, that no mortal has the right to hunt or capture it." Heracles, to his credit, didn't try to justify his actions or claim ignorance of the hind's sacred nature. Instead, he explained that he was acting under orders from Eurystheus, fulfilling the labours that had been imposed upon him as penance for killing his own family in a fit of madness sent by Hera. He offered to return the hind immediately if Artemis would accept his sincere apology and recognize that he had captured it without causing injury. Musa. The goddess considered this argument, and perhaps because Heracles had shown such skill and care in capturing the creature without harming it, or perhaps because she recognized that he was being used as a tool by others rather than acting from his own arrogance, she allowed him to continue. But she made it clear that the hind would be released as soon as it had been presented to Eurystheus, that its captivity would be temporary rather than permanent. The creature returned to her sacred mountains, still bearing its golden antlers and bronze hooves, still representing the principle that some things in the natural world belonged to the goddess alone. The relationship between Artemis and the moon developed gradually over centuries, a connection that wasn't part of her earliest worship, but became increasingly central to how she was understood and depicted. In the beginning, the moon belonged to Selene, a separate goddess who drove her lunar chariot across the night sky, while her brother Helios drove the sun across the day. But as Greek religion evolved, and different divine figures began to merge and overlap, Artemis absorbed many of Selene's attributes and became increasingly identified with the moon itself. This association made profound sense given everything else about Artemis's nature. The moon governs the rhythms of the natural world, the tides, the cycles of animals, the mysterious pull that affects female fertility and menstruation. It's the light source of the nighttime wilderness, illuminating the forests and mountains where Artemis hunted, casting shadows that transformed familiar landscapes into places of mystery and danger. The moon is changeable, waxing and waning, appearing and disappearing, never constant, much like the wild places that could be beautiful and welcoming, one moment deadly and hostile the next. Moreover, the moon exists in opposition to the sun, and this matched the relationship between Artemis and her twin brother Apollo. Apollo became increasingly associated with Helios and solar imagery. He was the god of light and prophecy, of civilization and order, of music and mathematics, and all the things that defined Greek culture at its most refined. Artemis, as his opposite and complement, aligned with lunar imagery. She was the goddess of darkness and mystery, of wilderness and instinct, of the liminal spaces where civilization ended and something older and more primal began. The silver bow that Artemis had commissioned from the Cyclopes and their underwater forges took on new meaning in this lunar context. Silver is the metal of moonlight, reflecting and channeling that cool, mysterious illumination. When Artemis drew her bow under the moon's light, she was wielding an instrument perfectly matched to her nature's silver arrows flying through silver-lit night, striking targets that couldn't be seen clearly in daylight, but were revealed in the particular clarity that moonlight provides. The ancient poets began describing Artemis with epithets that emphasized this lunar connection. She became the moon maiden, the silver goddess, the one who illuminated the night and governed its mysteries. Women who gave birth at night called upon her not just as the goddess of childbirth, but as the lunar power that governed the rhythms and cycles of female bodies. Hunters who tracked prey under moonlight invoked her name, asking for the vision to see in darkness and the skill to strike true when normal sight was compromised. Among all the animals sacred to Artemis, the bear held particular significance in certain regions, especially in Arcadia and at her sanctuary at Brauron in Attica. Bears were powerful and fierce, protective of their young with an intensity that made them dangerous to anyone who threatened their cubs. They were wild in ways that deer weren't, less graceful, more powerful, capable of violence when necessary. And they were fundamentally untamable, resistant to domestication in ways that matched Artemis's own refusal to be controlled or claimed. At Brauron, young girls between the ages of 5 and 10 served as toy little bears, performing rituals that prepared them for the transition into womanhood. They wore special garments, participated in dances and ceremonies, and for a brief period took on the identity of these wild, powerful creatures. The ritual acknowledged something important. These girls were still in that liminal space where wildness was permitted, where they belonged primarily to themselves rather than to the social structures that would eventually claim them through marriage. By serving as Artemis's little bears, they were claiming a piece of her strength and her fierce protection for themselves, storing up that wildness to carry forward into the domesticated lives they would eventually lead. And when they left childhood behind and entered into marriage and motherhood, they would remember those days at Brauron when they had danced as bears, when they had belonged to the goddess and to the wilderness, rather than to fathers or husbands. The story of Callisto takes on additional resonance in this context. She was transformed into a bear, taking on the form of Artemis's sacred animal, even as she was driven from the goddess's company. In bear form, she retained her human consciousness and her memories of hunting with Artemis and her nymphs, but she could never return to that fellowship, could never reclaim the identity she had lost. She wandered the wilderness alone, neither fully human nor fully animal, belonging nowhere, until her son nearly killed her, and Zeus finally ended her suffering by placing her among the stars. What united all these companions and creatures? The Oceanid nymphs singing in their eternal youth, the Hyperborean maidens who had transcended death, the mortal huntresses who earned divine respect, the sacred animals that carried impossible qualities, the moon that governed wilderness rhythms, was their relationship to freedom and choice. They weren't compelled into Artemis's service or forced to accept her standards. They chose her path, embraced her principles, committed to the same refusal of conventional boundaries that defined the goddess herself. And Artemis, in turn, protected them with fierce determination, creating spaces where they could exist according to their own natures rather than the expectations imposed by the larger world. The mountains and forests that belonged to her operated under different rules than the cities and cultivated plains where civilization held sway. In those wild places, beings who had chosen freedom could actually experience it, running and hunting and dancing without constant scrutiny or judgment or the pressure to conform. The ancient sources describe Artemis traveling across the ridges of mountains with her companions, moving through terrain that would have been impossible for ordinary beings, their laughter echoing across valleys and their arrows finding marks that seemed beyond the reach of mortal skill. These moments weren't simply recreational activities or ways to pass immortal time. They were the expression of a fundamental principle, that female beings deserved spaces where they could exist on their own terms, where their choices were respected and their boundaries were enforced, where they could be powerful and skilled and free without apology or justification. The fellowship around Artemis represented an alternative vision of female community, not women bound together by their relationships to men or their roles as wives and mothers, but beings united by shared values and mutual respect, by commitment to autonomy and wilderness, and the refusal to accept limitations. And at the center of that fellowship stood the goddess herself, silver bow in hand and moon overhead, as wild and free as she had been from her first moment of existence, leading her companions through the endless forests and across the eternal mountains that belonged to her alone. The transformation happened gradually, over centuries rather than in a single moment of divine revelation or cosmic reorganization. Artemis didn't wake up one day and suddenly discover she had absorbed the attributes of Selene and Hecate, didn't experience some mystical merger that reshaped her fundamental nature. Rather, as Greek religion evolved and adapted, as different regions with different traditions came into contact and their stories began to interweave, the boundaries between certain goddesses started to blur and overlap in ways that created something larger and more complex than any single deity had been originally. In the beginning, the moon belonged specifically to Selene, a titaness who drove her lunar chariot across the night sky, sister to Helios, the sun, and Eos, the dawn. She was the moon personified, her very existence tied to that celestial body's rising and setting, its waxing and waning across the monthly cycle. Stories told of her famous love affair with the mortal Endymion, whom she visited each night as he slept in eternal youth, bearing him 50 daughters who represented the lunar months. She was beauty and romance, the soft illumination of night, the gentle power that pulled tides and governed cycles but never threatened or demanded worship. Hecate, meanwhile, existed in darker territory. She was the goddess of crossroads and thresholds, of magic and witchcraft, of the boundaries between worlds. Her realm extended into the underworld itself, where she held considerable power and authority. She was depicted with torches in her hands, illuminating paths through darkness, guiding souls across the threshold between life and death. Where Selene was soft and romantic, Hecate was mysterious and somewhat frightening, associated with ghosts and night terrors and the dangerous magic that operated outside civilized boundaries. And Artemis, well, she had always been associated with wilderness and hunting, with virginity and childbirth, with the protection of young girls and the fierce enforcement of sacred boundaries. Her connection to the moon came later, developed gradually as people recognized the alignment between her nature and lunar characteristics. The moon governed the rhythms of the wild places where she hunted, illuminated the nighttime forests where predators stalked their prey, affected the cycles of animals and the mysterious patterns of female fertility. By the Hellenistic period, and especially during the Roman era, these three goddesses had begun to merge in worship and imagination, creating what some called the triple goddess, or the lunar trinity. Artemis representing the waxing moon and maiden aspect, Selene embodying the full moon and the mature woman, Hecate ruling the waning moon and the crone. This neat categorization satisfied a human desire for patterns and symmetry, for divine figures that reflected the stages of female life and the phases of the celestial body that seemed to govern so many natural rhythms. But it's important to understand that this trinity was largely a later construction, a theological development rather than original Greek belief. The earliest Greek sources don't present these goddesses as aspects of a single entity. They're separate beings with distinct personalities, domains, and mythologies. The conflation happened gradually, driven by several factors that intersected in complex ways. First, there was the simple fact that all three had lunar associations, even if those associations developed at different times and with different emphases. Once Artemis began to be depicted with a crescent moon or described as ruling the moon, it became natural to wonder about her relationship to Selene, who had always been the moon personified, and Hecate, who operated primarily at night and held torches that resembled lunar crescents, fit into this pattern as well. Second, there were overlapping characteristics that made the merger feel logical rather than arbitrary. Artemis and Hecate were both associated with crossroads. Artemis as the goddess of the literal paths through wilderness, Hecate as the deity of metaphorical crossroads where choices were made and destinies determined. Both were connected to magic and transformation, though Artemis's transformations were often punishments, while Hecate's were tools of her craft. Both had chthonic aspects, connections to the underworld and to death. Artemis through her swift arrows that brought sudden mortality, Hecate through her actual presence in the realm of the dead. Third, there was the practical reality of religious syncretism, the process by which conquering powers absorbed local deities into their own pantheons, or identified foreign gods with their native ones. As Greek culture spread through Alexander's conquests, and as Rome later absorbed Greek religion, goddesses with similar attributes were increasingly identified with each other, their distinct characteristics blending into composite figures that carried elements of multiple traditions. The Greek magical papyri, those collections of spells and rituals from the Hellenistic and Roman periods, emphasize a syncretism between Selene Hecate with Artemis and even Persephone, creating complex divine figures that combined attributes from multiple goddesses. In these magical texts, you find invocations that call upon Artemis, Hecate, Selene, as if they were a single entity with three names rather than three separate beings. The practitioners of magic didn't seem particularly concerned with maintaining clear boundaries between goddesses. They wanted access to whatever power could be channeled, regardless of its original source. What made the lunar association so powerful for Artemis specifically was how perfectly it aligned with everything she already represented. The moon governs the tides, not just of oceans, but of the blood cycles in female bodies, the fertility rhythms of animals, the mysterious pulls and patterns that operate below conscious awareness. Women in the ancient world understood that their menstrual cycles often synchronized with the moon's phases, that pregnancy lasted roughly 10 lunar months, that birth seemed more likely to occur during certain moon phases than others. Number Artemis, as protector of women in childbirth and guardian of young girls approaching womanhood, naturally became associated with these lunar rhythms. The goddess who had been present at her own birth and immediately helped deliver her twin brother, who understood the vulnerability of the labouring body and extended protection during that dangerous threshold. She was the perfect deity to invoke when the moon pulled at blood and water, when bodies prepared to bring new life into the world. Moreover, the moon's changeability matched Artemis's complex nature in ways that a solar deity's constancy never could. The sun rises and sets with predictable regularity, following the same path across the sky day after day. But the moon waxes and wanes, appears and disappears, shows different faces throughout its cycle. It can be bright enough to illuminate the entire landscape, or completely absent, leaving only starlight in the darkness. This changeability, this capacity to be multiple things rather than one constant presence, reflected Artemis's own multifaceted character. She was the protector of children and the bringer of sudden death to children. She was the helper of women in childbirth and the virgin who refused to ever experience pregnancy herself. She was fierce in her vengeance and tender in her protection, savage in the hunt, and gentle with her sacred animals. These apparent contradictions weren't flaws in her character or inconsistencies in her mythology. They were the essence of what she represented, and the moon's changing faces provided a perfect metaphor for that complexity. The weapon that Artemis had claimed for herself during her childhood quest, that silver bow crafted by the Cyclopes in their underwater forges, took on new significance in the context of her lunar associations. Silver is the metal of moonlight, reflecting and channeling that cool, mysterious illumination. When ancient poets described Artemis drawing her bow under the moon's glow, they were describing a perfect alignment of divine power, silver arrows flying through silver-lit darkness, guided by a goddess who embodied both the weapon and the light that allowed her to see her targets. Her twin brother Apollo carried a golden bow associated with the sun and with the clear, revealing light of day. His arrows brought plague and sudden death just as hers did, but his realm was illumination and prophecy, music and civilization, the ordered world of cities and temples where everything could be seen clearly. Artemis's silver bow operated differently. It struck from shadows, from the places where moonlight created ambiguity rather than clarity, where civilization ended and wilderness began. The Greeks loved these kinds of symmetries and oppositions, Apollo and Artemis as sun and moon, gold and silver, masculine and feminine, civilization and wilderness, clarity and mystery. But they also understood that these oppositions weren't absolute or antagonistic. They were complementary, two parts of a balanced whole that required both elements to function properly. Day needed night, and night needed day. The sun revealed what the moon concealed, and the moon protected what the sun exposed. Pew. In depictions from the Hellenistic period onward, Artemis increasingly appeared with a crescent moon in her hair or behind her shoulders, a clear visual statement of her lunar identity. Some showed her driving a chariot pulled by deer or horses across the night sky, taking over the role that had once belonged exclusively to Selene. The boundaries between the two goddesses had become permeable enough that artists and worshippers didn't always feel the need to distinguish between them. The virgin huntress and the moon personified had merged into a single figure that carried attributes of both. Hecate's influence on Artemis's evolving character brought in elements that had been less prominent in her earlier mythology, connections to the underworld, to magic and witchcraft, to the darker aspects of divine feminine power. Where Artemis had primarily operated in wilderness spaces above ground, ruling forests and mountains under the open sky, Hecate moved through liminal spaces and subterranean realms, her torches illuminating paths that led to places most mortals feared to go. The connection wasn't completely arbitrary or forced. There had always been chthonic elements in Artemis's worship, hints of connections to death and the afterlife that existed alongside her roles as protector and huntress. Her arrows brought sudden death, that swift transition from life to non-existence that was seen as a kind of mercy. She received dedications from women who survived childbirth, but also from the families of those who died during labour. Both outcomes fell under her domain, both required her blessing, or at least her acknowledgement. Hecate had a particular connection to one story in Artemis's mythology that seemed to invite their merger, the tale of Iphigenia, Agamemnon's daughter who was brought to Aulis to be sacrificed to Artemis so the Greek fleet could sail to Troy. In some versions, Artemis substituted a deer for Iphigenia at the last moment and spirited the girl away to become a priestess in a distant temple. But in other versions, particularly those preserved by the poet Hesiod, Iphigenia died and was transformed into the goddess Hecate herself. This connection suggested a deeper relationship between the two goddesses than simple syncretism could explain. If Iphigenia, who had been destined for sacrifice to Artemis, became Hecate through divine transformation, then perhaps the two goddesses represented different aspects of the same power. Artemis as the living virgin who refused domestication, Hecate as the death maiden who ruled thresholds and transformations. The Orphic tradition, that mystical strand of Greek religion focused on death, rebirth, and the soul's journey through multiple existences, developed its own complex understanding of Artemis and her relationships to other divine figures. In Orphic Fragment 356, the Orphic hymn to Artemis associates her especially with Dionysus and with the Titans, calling her mother Leto a Titaness, and emphasizing aspects of Artemis's nature that earlier sources had downplayed. Call. Why would Artemis be closely related to Dionysus, that god of wine and ecstasy and divine madness? Because both were frenzy-loving, mountain-haunting, bloodthirsty and savage, both represented forces that operated outside civilized boundaries, that celebrated wildness and ecstasy over order and restraint. The Maenads who followed Dionysus through the mountains, dancing themselves into trance states and tearing apart animals with their bare hands, weren't so different from Artemis's nymphs, hunting with fierce coordination and refusing the domestication of marriage. The Orphic hymn addresses Artemis with epithets that emphasize her cosmic power: august and mighty queen of all, fair blossom, eternal, sylvan, dog-loving, many-shaped lady. She's called upon as saviour, as the one who brings earth's fair fruits and lovely peace, but also as the one who banishes disease and pain to mountain peaks, the protector and the punisher, the giver and the taker, operating according to principles that transcended simple morality. In Orphic theology, Apollo's epithet was sometimes Hekatos, the masculine equivalent of Hecate. This linguistic connection suggested a profound symmetry. If Apollo as sun god could also be Hekatos, then Artemis as his twin and opposite must be Hecate herself, or at least share the same essential nature under different names. The logic was more poetic than rigorous, but it satisfied practitioners of mystery religions who were looking for underlying unities beneath apparent multiplicities, who believed that all divine power ultimately flowed from a single source that manifested in different forms. When the Romans absorbed Greek religion and identified their own deities with Greek counterparts, Artemis became Diana, and Diana, in turn, absorbed even more characteristics that pushed the goddess further toward her identity as a comprehensive lunar and magical figure. The Roman Diana was explicitly associated with the moon, with magic, with crossroads and transformations. She was invoked in magical rituals with Hecate and Selene, the three names becoming almost interchangeable in certain contexts. The Roman poet Ovid wrote of Diana in ways that emphasized her lunar aspects more strongly than earlier Greek sources had done with Artemis. Horace addressed prayers to Luna that could equally have been directed to Diana or Artemis, acknowledging the fluid boundaries between these identities. By the imperial period, educated Romans understood Diana Artemis as a moon goddess first and foremost, with her hunting and virginity aspects being secondary characteristics rather than her defining features. This represented a significant shift from her earliest worship in Greece, where Artemis had been primarily a goddess of wilderness and hunting, with lunar associations developing later. But divine identities weren't fixed or static in the ancient world. They evolved in response to changing cultural needs, absorbed characteristics from other deities when those mergers felt meaningful to worshippers, adapted to new contexts while maintaining core elements that made them recognizable. The triple Diana maiden mother crone, waxing full waning moon, heaven-earth underworld, became a powerful symbol in Roman religion and later in Western esoteric traditions. But it's worth noting that this neat tripartite division is more characteristic of Roman systematizing than of earlier Greek thought, which was generally more comfortable with ambiguity and overlapping divine roles. What remained constant through all these transformations and mergers, through the absorption of Selene's romance and Hecate's magic, and the moon's governing influence over tides and cycles, was Artemis's fundamental commitment to autonomy. She had asked Zeus as a 3-year-old child for eternal maidenhood, for freedom from the bonds of marriage and the vulnerability of childbearing, for mountains as her sacred spaces, and the right to define herself entirely on her own terms. That choice had defined everything that followed. Her fierce protection of her own virginity and that of her companions, her punishment of those who violated sacred boundaries, her refusal to be claimed or controlled by anyone regardless of their power or authority. When she merged with Selene and Hecate, she didn't compromise that essential autonomy. Rather, she expanded it, claiming more territory and more aspects of divine feminine power while maintaining the core principle that had always defined her existence. The moon goddess Artemis represented something that purely hunting goddess Artemis or purely virgin goddess Artemis couldn't capture alone. She became the embodiment of female power operating outside patriarchal control, not through relationship to fathers or husbands or children, but through relationship to herself and to the wild spaces and mysterious rhythms that civilization couldn't fully domesticate. Women in the Hellenistic and Roman periods invoked Artemis, Diana Hecate, in magical spells that sought to claim power over their own lives, to make choices about fertility and relationships and futures that society tried to deny them. The goddess who had refused marriage became the patron of those who wanted to refuse it themselves, or to end unwanted pregnancies, or to protect themselves from male violence. The goddess who governed the moon became associated with all the mysterious powers that operated by night and in secret, beyond the scrutiny of fathers and husbands and the daytime world where men held uncontested authority. The transformation of Artemis from wilderness huntress to comprehensive lunar goddess represents one of the most successful examples of divine evolution in Western mythology. She didn't lose her original characteristics when she absorbed aspects of Selene and Hecate. The silver bow still hung at her shoulder, the sacred deer still ran with her through mountain forests, her nymphs still danced in wild clearings where mortal eyes weren't permitted. But she gained additional dimensions, additional powers, additional significance in the lives of those who worshipped her. By the end of the ancient period, Artemis had become something larger than any single deity usually achieved. She was the maiden aspect of the triple goddess, the new moon's promise, the protector of wilderness and women, the bringer of death and the helper in childbirth, the untamed power that civilization could never fully control. She ruled the rhythms that governed female bodies and animal fertility, the tides that pulled at blood and water, the mysterious forces that operated by moonlight and in shadow. She represented the possibility of female existence outside the structures that normally defined and limited it. A woman who worshipped Artemis could imagine, even if only briefly, even if only in ritual space, what it might feel like to be free, to belong to herself rather than to father or husband, to make choices based on her own desires rather than social expectations. A girl serving as a little bear at Brauron could experience, for a moment, the wild strength of the goddess herself, could carry that memory forward into the domesticated life that awaited her. The ancient sources describe Artemis, traveling across ridges of mountains under the moon's light, her silver bow gleaming, her nymphs singing behind her, wild creatures moving aside to let her pass. This image captured something essential about what she represented across all her various aspects and merged identities. The divine feminine that refused domestication, that claimed wild spaces and mysterious powers, that operated according to its own principles rather than accepting the limitations that others tried to impose. When the Roman Empire fell and Christianity became dominant across Europe, many ancient deities were forgotten or transformed into demons and monsters in the new religious framework. But Artemis, or Diana, as she was more commonly known by then, persisted in ways that few other pagan gods managed. She lived on in folk traditions about moon goddesses and wild hunts, in stories of women who ran with wolves and refused marriage, in the image of the powerful virgin who protected rather than submitted. Medieval and Renaissance writers occasionally referenced her, though often in Christianized forms that stripped away her more threatening aspects. But she never quite disappeared, never became safely domesticated, even when Christian theology tried to contain her within acceptable frameworks. There was something in the core of her mythology that resisted appropriation, that fundamental commitment to autonomy, that refusal to be claimed or controlled, that fierce protection of boundaries and wild spaces. In modern times, she has experienced a kind of revival, becoming a powerful symbol for feminist movements and for those who seek to reclaim aspects of divine feminine power that patriarchal religions had suppressed. Contemporary pagans invoke her name in rituals that celebrate female autonomy and wilderness preservation, recognizing in her ancient mythology something that still speaks to current struggles and aspirations. The girl who sat in Zeus's lap and asked for eternal maidenhood, who travelled to claim her own silver bow and her own hunting hounds, who ran across mountains with nymphs who had chosen her path. She became the goddess who merged with moon and magic, who ruled rhythms and transformations, who represented the possibility of female power operating on its own terms. And across thousands of years, through countless transformations and cultural shifts, that essential core remained constant. Artemis was the one who chose freedom, who refused to compromise her autonomy regardless of what was offered or threatened, who demonstrated that divine feminine power didn't require relationship to masculine authority to be real and formidable. The moon still rises over the mountains where she once hunted, still waxes and wanes through its eternal cycle, still pulls at tides and blood, and the mysterious rhythms that govern life itself. And somewhere in those silver-lit forests, in the wild places where civilization hasn't yet reached, the goddess still runs with her bow and her hounds, as untamed and eternal as she was on the day she first opened her eyes and chose to help her mother, to be the midwife before she was anything else, to protect the vulnerable while remaining forever free.